Carl Jung's final warning about the empath will fundamentally rewire how you view your own kindness. For most of your life, you've likely been told that your sensitivity is a rare spiritual gift or a higher calling. Jung pulls back the curtain on a much harsher reality. That gift is often a sophisticated survival mechanism forged in the fires of childhood neglect or instability. When you were young, you weren't allowed to be a child. You weren't allowed to be loud, demanding, or selfish. You learned very early that your only value in the family dynamic was your ability to keep the peace. This created a version of you that is hyper-attuned to everyone else's pain while being completely deaf to your own. You didn't choose this path because you were holier than others. You chose it because your very existence felt conditional on making sure the adults around you stayed regulated. This is the core of the empath trap. You've spent decades believing that your overwhelming urge to fix people is a sign of your strength, when it is actually the ghost of a child trying to stay safe. Jung identified this as a form of self-erasure. By absorbing the emotions of others, you effectively disappear yourself. You become a mirror, reflecting what everyone else needs, while your own authentic self remains locked in a basement. This isn't just being nice, it's a deep-seated programming that tells you that being yourself is a threat to your survival. Until you realize that your compassion is a byproduct of this conditional existence, you will remain a prisoner to other people's emotional states, perpetually exhausted and spiritually drained. To understand why this is so hard to break, you have to look at the science of hypervigilance. While other children were learning how to play and explore, you were busy becoming a human seismograph. If you grew up in an environment where a parent's mood could shift like a storm, your nervous system had to adapt to survive. You didn't just learn to read the room. Your brain literally rewired itself to detect the slightest change in tone, the tension in a jawline, or the heavy silence of a closing door. Jung called this premature ego adaptation. You developed high-level psychological radar long before you had the emotional maturity to handle it. Your brain prioritized the other over the self, because in your world, knowing what the other felt was the only way to prevent a crisis. This biological rewiring creates what Jungian psychology calls the empathic paradox. You are an expert on the inner lives of strangers, but a total stranger to yourself. Because you spent your formative years looking outward for danger, you never learned how to look inward for identity. This leads to a devastating suppression of healthy narcissism. Most people hear the word narcissism and think of vanity, but Jung knew that every child needs a healthy dose of it to develop a strong sense of I am. You were denied this. You were taught that having needs was dangerous or burdensome, so you buried your desires and replaced them with a performance of empathy. You became a detective of the soul, constantly investigating everyone else's needs, while your own heart went into a state of permanent hibernation. However, Jung's message isn't one of despair, it's a roadmap for revolution. He didn't see the empath as broken, he saw them as stuck in the middle of individuation, the psychological process of becoming a complete human being. You have already mastered the outer world of empathy. Now the second half of your life demands that you master the inner world of the self. You have felt the crushing cost of your sensitivity for years, the burnout, the resentment, and the feeling that you are being used. These aren't signs of failure. They are your psyche's way of screaming that it's time to stop sacrificing your authentic self to keep others comfortable. The burden you carry is the weight of a false identity that was built to serve people who couldn't serve themselves. The final stage of this journey is reclaiming sacred selfishness. This is the point where you realize that your first and most important responsibility is to your own psychological development. It's the shift from compulsive empathy, where you feel because you have no choice, to conscious empathy, where you choose when and where to give your energy. Jung's final warning is actually an invitation to reclaim your power. It's about building a skin where you previously only had raw nerves. When you integrate your forbidden selfishness, you don't become a bad person, you become a whole person. You finally give yourself permission to exist, not as a tool for others, but as an individual who is allowed to say no without guilt and yes with purpose. The concept of the shadow is perhaps Carl Jung's most vital contribution to understanding the empath's struggle. In Jungian psychology, the shadow isn't a place of evil. It is simply a storage room for the parts of yourself that were deemed unacceptable when you were growing up. For the empath, this storage room is packed with the very tools you need to survive adulthood: your anger, your ability to say no, and your drive for self-preservation. Because you were rewarded for being the good child, the helper, or the peacekeeper, you learned to shove your own needs into the darkness. You became a wounded healer, a person who tries to mend the world while ignoring the bleeding wounds in their own soul. You give and give, but because you've locked away your selfish traits, you aren't giving from a place of abundance. You are giving from a void, essentially spending currency you don't actually have. This creates a dangerous internal state that Jung called the compensation principle. The psyche is a self-balancing system. It cannot stay one-sided forever. When you spend all your time being light, kind, and selfless, your shadow grows heavy with darkness, rage, and resentment. You might look calm on the outside, but underneath that polished exterior lies a hidden reservoir of bitterness. You start to feel a deep, quiet anger toward the people you are helping, not because they are bad, but because they are taking the energy you haven't learned how to protect. Your psyche is desperately trying to balance your extreme self-sacrifice by producing internal rage. If you don't acknowledge this anger, it doesn't just go away, it leaks out as passive aggression, chronic fatigue, or sudden, unexplainable emotional outbursts. If you continue to ignore these shadow traits, you will eventually hit the wall of empathic burnout. This isn't the kind of tiredness that a weekend nap can fix. This is a profound, bone-deep soul exhaustion. It is the feeling that your compassion tank has run completely dry and been replaced with a layer of grit. Jung identified this not as a mental breakdown, but as an individuation imperative. Your soul is literally rebelling against your role as a professional people pleaser. It is tired of being abandoned by you. This burnout is a high-voltage signal from your authentic self, demanding that you stop living for others and start living for yourself. It is a forced pause, a psychological strike where your mind refuses to cooperate with your helper identity any longer because that identity has become a cage. To heal, you must bridge what Jung saw as the ultimate gap, the distance between your caring self and your self-caring self. This requires the radical act of bringing your shadow into the light. You have to learn that your anger is actually a guardian. It is the emotion that tells you when a boundary has been crossed. You have to realize that the word no is not a weapon of cruelty, but a tool of integrity. Integrating your shadow means accepting that you are allowed to have needs, you are allowed to be tired, and you are allowed to put yourself first. When you finally stop fighting these selfish parts of yourself, the resentment vanishes. You stop being a wounded healer who gives to be loved, and you become an integrated healer who gives because they have more than enough to spare. This is the moment you stop performing empathy and start living with authentic power. Reclaiming your life through sacred selfishness is the most radical act an empath can perform. For years, you've likely been conditioned to believe that putting yourself first is a sin, a betrayal, or a sign of coldness. Jungian psychology flips this narrative on its head. Sacred selfishness isn't about becoming a narcissist or lacking heart. It is about establishing emotional sovereignty. This is the hard-won realization that you are the absolute ruler of your own internal landscape, and more importantly, that you are not the manager of anyone else's. When you live without sovereignty, you are essentially an open border, allowing every passerby to dump their emotional baggage, their bad moods, and their unresolved trauma directly into your psyche. Choosing sacred selfishness means finally building a fence. It is the understanding that while you can care for someone, you cannot and should not carry them. Transitioning into this state of sovereignty usually triggers a massive shift in your social circle, and Jung warned that it wouldn't always be pretty. When you stop playing the fixer, the sponge, or the unpaid therapist, the people in your life who were benefiting from your self-abandonment will naturally get angry. They aren't necessarily bad people, but they have grown accustomed to a free emotional supply that you've been providing at the expense of your own health. They might call you cold, changed, or selfish in an attempt to manipulate you back into your old, compliant role. This is the ultimate test of your growth. Jung observed that this friction is actually a filtration system. The relationships that fall apart were never based on you as a person. They were based on you as a function. However, the relationships that survive this shift become authentic encounters. For the first time, you are seen as a whole, equal human being rather than an emotional tool, allowing for a depth of connection that was previously impossible. The ultimate reward of this transformation is the birth of conscious empathy. Up until now, your empathy has likely been an on switch that you couldn't control, a gut-level compulsion that forced you to feel everything, everywhere, all at once. With sacred selfishness, you finally gain a dial. You move from being a victim of your sensitivity to being a master of it. You no longer feel with others because your survival depends on it. You choose to feel with them because you have decided to offer that gift. This shift creates what Jung termed compassionate detachment. It sounds like a contradiction, but it is actually the highest form of helping. It allows you to stand close enough to a person to offer genuine support and warmth, but far enough away to keep your own perspective clear. You become like a lighthouse. You provide the light to guide others through the storm, but you don't jump into the ocean and drown with them. When you master this loving distance, the era of bleeding yourself dry officially ends. You stop giving from your principle and start giving from the interest. This is the difference between a person who helps out of a desperate need to be needed and a person who helps from a state of overflow. When your own well-being is non-negotiable and your cup is full, your empathy becomes a precision tool rather than a blunt instrument of self-destruction. You can witness pain without absorbing it. You can offer a hand without losing your arm. This is the foundation of authentic power, the ability to be a deeply sensitive, caring individual who is also unshakable and grounded in their own identity. You are finally free to be the version of yourself that the world actually needs, not a martyr, but a conscious, integrated, and whole human being. Jung's most profound final insight is the realization that your sensitivity only becomes a true superpower when it is rooted in personal strength rather than a desperate need for survival. For most of your life, your empathy has been a shield, a way to navigate a world that felt unsafe or unpredictable. But the hero's journey for the empath isn't about slaying an external dragon. It's about slaying the internal ghost of the people-pleaser and reclaiming your absolute right to exist without offering an apology to anyone. You have spent years being told or feeling that you are too much, too sensitive, too emotional, or too intense. Jung flips this narrative entirely. You aren't too much for the world, you are simply, for the first time, becoming enough for yourself. This shift in perspective changes everything because it moves you from a state of victimhood to a state of mastery. This journey requires you to accept a radical truth. True service to others does not and cannot come from self-destruction. We have been conditioned to believe that the more we suffer for others, the more good we are. Jung argues the opposite. A person who breaks themselves to fix others isn't offering a gift. They are offering a trauma response disguised as virtue. Genuine compassion comes from a conscious individual who knows their own worth and protects their own energy with ferocity. When you are whole, your help is clean. It doesn't come with the hidden strings of needing validation or the toxic buildup of resentment. You stop being a martyr and start being a beacon. You realize that the most spiritual thing you can do is to become a fully realized, boundaried human being who chooses where their light is directed. Reclaiming your sacred selfishness is the final stage of this heroic transformation. It is the moment you decide to stop giving from a place of emptiness and start living from a place of intentional choice. Think about the difference between a debt and a gift. When you give from survival programming, you are paying a debt you don't even owe, trying to buy your safety or your right to be loved. But when you give from overflow, you are offering a genuine gift from a surplus of energy and self-love. This isn't just a lifestyle change, it is a total psychological rebirth. You are no longer a sponge soaking up the world's toxins. You are a powerhouse who decides exactly how much of yourself is available for public consumption. You learn to nurture the child who wasn't allowed to be selfish by becoming the adult who refuses to be exploited. As you complete this journey to wholeness, you discover that your sensitivity, when combined with healthy ego strength, is actually a precision tool for change. You can see what others miss. You can feel the deep undercurrents of a situation, and you can offer profound wisdom. But you do it all while standing on solid ground. You no longer disappear into the pain of others. Instead, you hold a space of such high frequency and self-assurance that others are inspired to find their own strength. This is the ultimate goal of Jungian individuation, to be a person who is both deeply connected to the human experience and entirely sovereign within their own soul. You are finally free to give because you want to, not because you have to. If you are ready to end the cycle of self-abandonment and step into your authentic power, let this be your declaration. I give from overflow, not emptiness. Reclaim your sacred selfishness and start your true life today.